The committee will come to order. We're meeting this morning to consider 6 different bills within the committee's jurisdiction. We will consider each bill individually with a separate opening statement and walk through for each. The first order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Gerlach and Mr. Thompson to make permanent the special rule for contributions of qualified conservation contributions. Mr. Gerlach, you are now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your leadership in bringing H.R. 2807 before the committee today. There is no doubt that we must transform our tax code. Along with providing simplicity and fairness, comprehensive tax reform will promote robust economic growth, create new jobs, and allow American businesses to compete in the global economy. That being said, while we must continue our efforts to shed those sections of the tax code that snuff out opportunity and bury job creators under mountains of paperwork, we also must work to preserve those provisions that have proven successful and allow individuals, business owners, and our communities to thrive. Today, we highlight one such provision in our tax code that the farmers, property owners, and community leaders of my district believe is worthy of preservation. H.R. 2807, the Conservation Easement Incentive Act, which I introduced with my friend Mr. Thompson of California, is simple, straightforward legislation that would make permanent the conservation easement tax incentive. Not only do my constituents support this common sense proposal, but over 200 of our colleagues in the House and Senate, including a majority in this committee, have co-sponsored this bill. And earlier this year, Mr. Chairman, it was great to see the provisions of this legislation included as part of your tax reform discussion draft, as well as the administration's FY15 budget proposal. In Washington, it's hard to find that level of consensus. But in countless communities across the country, our constituents believe that there should be a permanent, enhanced tax incentive for conserving open spaces and farmland. The conservation easement is a proven, effective, and important tool that allows property owners the ability to retire development rights on their land to conserve significant natural resources, protect clean water, and preserve wild habitat, and safeguard farmland and working forests. Mr. Chairman, the conservation easement tax credit works. Before expiring at the end of 2013, modest income property owners, family farmers, and other landowners utilize this incentive to voluntarily protect millions of acres of land across the country. Further, the benefits derived from conservation easements extend well beyond property lines. For example, a regional study released in November of 2010 by the Green Space Alliance and the Delaware Valley Regional Planning Commission found that preserved open space in the 5 counties of southeastern Pennsylvania added $16.3 billion of home value to the region's homeowners, supported nearly 7,000 jobs annually in industries including agriculture, tourism, hospitality, and recreation, saved more than $130 million in water treatment and flood control costs, and through enhanced recreation at area parks and trails avoided $1.3 billion in health-related costs. In closing, Mr. Chairman, whether as a farmer looking to preserve land that's been in the family for generations or a local organization working to protect a community's natural resources, this legislation is a bipartisan solution to provide property owners with the freedom, opportunity, and certainty they deserve when making critical choices about the use and future of their land. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you. A month ago, Republicans on this committee voted to add $310 billion to the deficit by making permanent 6 separate tax provisions. Today, they will nearly double that number, adding another $287 billion to the deficit, with a vote on a single tax provision that not only was never meant to be permanent, but one that loses its effectiveness when made so. I and many of my colleagues have and continue to support a temporary extension of bonus depreciation because it provides capital-intensive businesses with an incentive to invest in new equipment now, allowing them to write off the cost at a faster rate than normal. It is called bonus depreciation for just that reason. But what the majority is doing today completely eliminates that incentive. Indeed, the Congressional Research Service notes that the measure in, quote, temporary nature is critical to its effectiveness, end of quotes. What's more, making it permanent contradicts the Republican tax reform draft, which in February proposed repealing the measure entirely. As CRS noted, I quote, "Moving to permanent bonus depreciation is inconsistent with Chairman Camp's proposal. The last decade highlights the temporary nature of this policy. It was put in place during the recession at the early part of the last decade, before being allowed to expire in 2005 as the economy improved. In 2008, as a new, deeper recession took hold, the policy was put in place again. Without an offset, the $287 billion price tag would bring the total that this committee has voted to add to the deficit in the last month to $600 billion. That's not only more than the entire federal deficit this year, it's greater than all non-defense domestic discretionary spending in 2014. In moving forward with a permanent extension of a select group of tax extenders, the majority is once again leaving to an increasingly uncertain fate provisions like the Work Opportunity Tax Credit, the American Opportunity Tax Credit, the New Markets Tax Credit, the Mortgage Relief Debt Forgiveness, and the Renewable Energy Tax Credits, as well as the long-range status of EITC and the Child Tax Credit. And that is not to mention their complete inaction so far on federal unemployment insurance. The cost of bonus depreciation of extending it this way could pay for a full-year extension of unemployment benefits 10 times over. The majority has cloaked the extension of bonus depreciation within a package of important tax incentives that support charities and the good work they do in our communities. Indeed, I co-authored alongside Congressman Gerlach the bill to extend the deduction for food inventory donations. But we are not here today basically to debate the good works of charities or nutrition programs or conservation across this country. There is agreement about their significance, but it is a mistake to approach them in a way that makes provisions permanent, without consideration of their place in a broader framework, and with reckless disregard for their cost and their impact on other provisions, especially at a time of immense pressures on non-defense discretionary programs. I yield the balance of my time now to Mr. Thompson.
I'm in support of this measure, extending conservation easements long-term. I'm a co-author with Mr. Gerlach, as he mentioned. Before that, Chairman Camp was, when we were in the majority, was my co-author on the bill. And there are a lot of co-authors, and the reason there are a lot of co-authors is because it's a good bill, and we should make it permanent. A lot of people benefit, people in rural areas, conservation groups, hunters, fishers, farmers, ranchers. City folks benefit too. Look no further than New York City. Their watershed is under terrible pressure, and it was through conservation easements that we're able to protect the water of the citizens of New York. So passing it's the right thing to do. But to do it by adding to our national debt is just absolutely wrong, and we need to pay for this bill. As the ranking member pointed out, with the passage of these bills today, we'll be up over $600 billion added to our national debt. We need to pass these good bills, but we need to do it right. We need to do it by paying for it. Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment that would pay for this provision when the time is right. I'd like the opportunity to introduce it.
All right. The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 2807. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll now turn to Mr. Tom Barthold, Chief of Staff to the Joint Committee on Taxation, to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. And I would ask that members hold their questions until after his presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Levin. The members have before them Joint Committee documents JCX 53, which describes the underlying bill H.R. 2807, and JCX 59, the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. By way of brief background, the proposal of the provision of law which expired at the end of 2013 provided in the case of conservation easements that the otherwise applicable 30% percentage limitation on an annual charitable donation and the carry forward period of 5 years would be 50% and a 15-year period. Those provisions expired at the end of 2013. The bill before you today would make the 50% and 15-year period permanent law. The chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, provides that this would be effective for contributions made in taxable years beginning after 2013. That concludes my brief description. Happy to answer any questions members might have.
All right, thank you. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold?
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Mr. Neal.
Mr. Barthold, have you had a chance to see the Senate provision, Mr. Wyden's proposal on extenders?
Yes, sir.
How is he paid for this provision?
The reported bill, the Expire Act, as it was named by the Finance Committee, did 2-year extensions. So it extended this provision and a number of others for calendar years 2014 and 2015. And to the extent that it was a straight extension of prior law or present law, offsets were not required. Within the committee markup, they placed upon themselves a rule that they would ask for offsets if there were modifications that expanded or otherwise led to an increased loss in revenues beyond the straight 2-year extension. Okay. So relative to a 2-year extension, there was no offset for this provision, Mr. Neal.
Mr. Chairman, at the appropriate moment, I intend to offer Mr. Wyden's provision.
All right. In terms of substance, though, Mr. Barthold, in answer to Mr. Neal, they're very similar provisions other than the time. The Expire Act from the Finance Committee would extend prior law for 2 years, for 2014 and 2015, identical to what the provision before the committee here today does. In addition, what's before the committee today would make it permanent law, so after 2015, 2016, 17, 18,
Mr. Chairman, would you yield for a question?
Yes.
Isn't that what we're really doing here today?
What we're trying to do, since this has been extended 4 times,
and my sense is probably get to 5 fairly quickly.
We'll try to. I think it's important not to have temporary policy, especially when you look at long-term investments that are made in connection with conservation easements. So that's the reason why I think it's important to do it in a permanent
Mr. Chairman, would you
basis.
further yield?
Yes.
But the reason we're doing this is because we were not able to move forward with tax reform fundamentally. That's the challenge. That's the problem. And we're going to end up after the election doing a 2-year extension, which really is going to be a 1-year extension based upon the suggestion that the first year is already passed. So I think that rather than having this markup today, we should have just perhaps vetted some of these issues, but really to understand that we're in the end going to come very close to accepting the Senate provisions.
Well, I don't think we're going to accept just what the Senate has done. I think that we have certainly a different view on that, in that they are happy with temporary policy. I'm not. And I think many House members are not. And on appropriate policies, I think we ought to try to make them permanent. And that's what this provision does.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Mr. Rangel's recognized.
Thank you. When I was chairman, you were very helpful as I was with staff drafting a tax reform bill. And I assume that you were of great help to our present chair in the draft that he prepared.
Our staff tried to assist the chairman in any way that he saw it, as we try to help all the members of the Tax Writing Committee.
Well, since I'm confident that the chair was trying to reduce the deficit in his courageous attempt to reform the tax code, is it not true that in the draft, most of these extensions were either repealed or they were paid for and did not increase the deficit?
Well, I can let the chairman speak for himself, but as a general matter, Chairman did lay out as a goal that he would produce a revenue-neutral package, and he made policy choices to extend some expiring provisions and to allow others to either affirmatively to repeal them or to allow provisions that had expired to remain expired.
But in the sense of trying to make certain of the extensions permanent, did he not provide for revenue to make it revenue neutral?
Well, as my colleagues estimated in the revenue table that we prepared for the chairman's discussion draft, the chairman was successful in achieving a 10-year revenue-neutral bill.
Well, that's my point. Could you share with us the economic reasons why what was either repealed or paid for, as to what looks like a complete reversal in what was revenue neutral, dramatically increases the deficit, and allows issues of extension that are here before us today as permanent that were issues that were repealed? Is there any economic sense to that at all that you can share with us? Because I respect the chair's draft, because I thought it was pretty honest and forthright. But if indeed what is presented today, Mr. Chairman, is actually an economic legislative reversal of that policy, I think the American people, and certainly this committee, who's placed on here not just to vote what is popular, but to vote what is right, and we're selected by both parties for that reasons. Could you share with me your opinions as to the difference between the draft bill and the made permanent provisions that are before us today?
Well, Mr. Rangel, my opinions on policy matters don't count. You're all elected representatives.
I understand that, Mr. Bartle, and I'm sorry to put you in that spot. It's embarrassing for us as well, but this is what we're here for. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. Mr. Gerlach.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to make a comment, if I can, on the issue of extending temporarily another year or two versus the permanency that this legislation allows for. For those that have a very significant open space and farmland preservation program ongoing in their area, they know very well that it is very difficult to have a continuity in those efforts to preserve valuable habitat, valuable farmland year after year, with the landowners that are considering it, giving up their development rights through a conservation easement, through municipalities and state programs that want to contribute dollars, through various land trusts and other organizations that want to help with that process. When you have this fluctuation in tax policy, and the value of the permanency aspect of this legislation is such that it sends the signal to all of those organizations that work on this every single day, both as governmental program implementers as well as those that are charitable organizations, as well as interested individual citizens, that having this aspect of the tax code made permanent allows them to do ongoing work day after day in their communities, to line up the parties, to line up the different levels of funding and different streams of funding, to eventually to have a landowner say, yes, all of this is going to work for me, it's going to work for my family today, it's going to work for us for future generations. Now's the time to put the land in conservation easement. So the value of this legislation in extending out what expired at the end of 2013 is the permanency of the policy. And so all of those organizations and all of those people interested in conserving land in their communities are going to have the green light to continue to work every day together to allow a lot of good projects to move forward. And I think that gets lost in some of the legislative talk around here about should it be extended for 1 year, 2 years, or on a permanent basis. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
If I just might ask on your time, you I think correctly point out the generational nature of these decisions, that these are not just two-year decisions, that these often have ramifications for, particularly in farms, ranches, and virtually every other kind of decision, how critical that is for permanency. I just want to mention that our good friend Senator Dick Durbin, our former House colleague, said, the longer a temporary matter continues, the more likely it becomes permanent, he said. When does a temporary extender become a permanent extender? It's a question we ought to answer. I think in the conservation area, we ought to answer yes. This is critical enough. 200 House members have supported it. 23 members of the Ways and Means Committee support. Almost an equal number of Republicans and Democrats support permanency in this area. I think it's a very valuable
Mr. Chairman?
thing, and I yield back to
Mr. Gillick, would you yield?
Yeah, so yield.
The dispute here is not over the policy outcome or the substance of the proposal. By and large, we're all for it. It is a worthwhile undertaking. The dispute we have this morning is very simply that we are here because we couldn't proceed with tax reform. So now we're to argue about the likelihood of this becoming permanent. Everybody seated here today knows there is very little prospect of this becoming permanent. We are going to do something after the election, and I think that's the objection that we have on this side to the manner in which this hearing this morning markup is playing out.
Okay. Thank you. Yield back.
Well, and if I just could say, look, if we're not going to pay for things on an ongoing temporary basis, every 2 years, which we haven't done in the 3 or 4 times this has been extended, I think we should just be honest about it and call it what it is. We're going to extend this, and we're either going to extend it for 2 years at the end of the year, depending on if the Senate position prevails, or if the House position prevails, I hope, which will become the House position, that will make it permanent. And so that's why I think it's relevant here to do that. But I think,
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah, Mr. Levin's recognized.
Just very briefly, it's one thing to not pay for and do it for a year or two, and it's another thing to make it permanent and not pay for it. And your bill, we did not participate after the working groups in putting it together. But our reaction to it was modulated because it was, I think, an honest effort to try to look at tax reform and to do so in a way that was revenue neutral. And we disagreed with the principle of only revenue neutrality because we thought there should be some additional revenue. But at least it was revenue neutral. It was paid for when made permanent. And the step that's now being taken is to essentially say we can make tax provisions permanent and not pay for them. And so when you add up what's doing today, the 310 from the previous action, with the total here, it's well over $600 billion. And that doesn't include other provisions that we know will be in the tax extender bill and that we'll want in the 1 or 2 year bill, like the work opportunity tax credit or other tax provisions relating to sales tax and other provisions that are still to come. And so I want to just reinforce the conservation provision is important, and no one's denying that. But to say here, contrary to what was done in your proposal, that we're going to make it permanent and not pay for it is, I think, not only inconsistent, but is irresponsible. And so let's not say that we don't care about this. We deeply care about this. We also care about how it's done. Thank you.
All right. Are there further questions, or should we move to Mr. Thompson's amendment? Mr. Kind.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do have a question for Mr. Barthel. Mr. Barthel, as this committee is fully aware, just a few weeks ago, to the chairman's credit, he produced a comprehensive tax reform draft discussion after 3 years of endless hearings and discussions and task force and meetings on it. And I commended the chairman then, and I continue to commend him for the courage he showed in coming out with at least that discussion draft. But Mr. Barthel, there were some specific provisions that we're dealing with today that were also addressed in the discussion draft, and I'd just like some clarification from you how the chairman treated those provisions in the comprehensive draft that he proposed. The bonus depreciation, for instance, do you recall how that was treated in the comprehensive discussion draft?
In the chairman's discussion draft, he had a substantial rewrite of a number of cost recovery rules. As a general matter, he went to the ADR system of depreciation rather than extending bonus. Also had a number of other changes related to amortization of different types of capital expenditures.
So in effect, he repealed the provision that's before us today that we're considering.
Well, he did not extend it. His depreciation changes were delayed a year in start.
And what about the enhanced charitable deduction for food donations? Do you know how that was treated in the discussion draft?
That was not included.
So that was repealed as well.
That was not part of his discussion draft. That was allowed to expire.
And I believe, you can correct me, but he was silent in his discussion draft about the IRA rollovers that are before us today. So in effect, that would have
that provision
expired.
was allowed to remain expired.
That would have remained to be expired. Yeah. You know, Mr. Chairman, to your credit, again, when you introduced that discussion draft, you found certain tax breaks in the code to repeal or get rid of in a way to pay for the simplification that you were aiming for and the lowering of rates. And yet today we're coming forward with another 6-provision package, none of it offset, none of it paid for. This comes on the heels of just a few weeks ago when you had your own budget resolution on the House floor that called for offsets to be paid for any permanent tax changes. You all voted for that. And now, a few weeks later, you're here with another package of $287 billion worth of tax extenders over the next 10 years, and not a nickel of it paid for. So I don't think it's fair for you to be on the floor a few weeks ago arguing about the fiscal responsibility of a budget resolution that you were offering the American people, and then a few short weeks later, you're coming forward with tax extenders without paying for it. You know, a couple of weeks ago, 6 extenders at a cost of $310 billion, none of it paid for. Now today, another 6 extenders at a cost of $287 billion in just the first 10 years, none of it paid for. And I guess that's the concern that many of us have on this side, is the lack of any type of fiscal consistency or fiscal responsibility with how we're addressing these major policy tax changes. And if there's a way for us to go back and scrub the list of the expenditures that you got rid of in your discussion draft because you wanted to make it revenue neutral, and scrub the list of the president's budget that he submitted earlier this year that also offered a lot of elimination of tax provisions in order to pay for other changes in the tax code, I think we can get to a bipartisan place. It's going to require some tough decisions, and quite frankly, having to say no to some very powerful special interests in this town in order to pass these on a permanent basis, which I think makes good policy. But it's fiscally irresponsible to be offering it in this fashion, especially knowing the direction that the Senate is going, and especially given veto threats coming out of the White House right now. I think as far as the policy behind a lot of what we're discussing here today, there's not going to be much daylight separating us. The real issue is, what does this mean to our unfunded liabilities in the out years, and what is going to be the revenue impact and the budget implications? And I think, you know, to the chairman of the Budget Committee's credit, he produced a budget resolution that required under that resolution that offsets be found for any permanent extension within the tax code. So which is it going to be? You're going to stand and defend the budget resolution you just voted a few weeks ago, or are we going off into another direction of $597 billion of unpaid for permanent tax changes in the tax code? And if that's the way it is, then let's just be honest about it. And why don't you just start taking ownership of the large budget deficits and the national debt that we have, rather than trying to lay this at the doorstep of the current occupant in the White House. That's the point that I wanted to make today.
Yeah, if I just, since you raised the draft, let me just say, we do want to be honest about it. And if we go the direction the Senate is going, all 60-plus extenders will be extended and not paid for. If conservation easement is one of those, that would be the 5th 2-year period. That's basically a budget window. So we've extended it for a budget window, not paid for it. I think we do need to be honest and call it what it is. The discussion draft said we asked for comment on the extenders. What should we do about the extenders? Should they be made permanent? Should they be paid for? And the answer we got overwhelmingly back was extenders should be made permanent to the extent that they're long-term, and we shouldn't pay for extensions of current policy. We shouldn't have to raise taxes other places in the economy to keep current tax law. I mean, there is no rationale for that. So I appreciate the arguments you're making, but I think it's very important that, look, if we've extended something for 10 years, I think let's call it what it is. That's permanent policy.
Mr. Chairman,
if
just
it's permanent
yeah,
I
Mr.
mean,
Chairman, reclaiming my time.
I'm happy, well, your time expired, but I'm happy to have you respond.
Yeah, you get no argument from me as far as the policy implications of trying to do permanency in the code. I am with you 110% on that. But where you lose me is the inconsistency in the argument of a budget resolution and then the unpaid for aspect today. And the implications that's going to have, not just within the first 10 years, but it's the second, third, and fourth 10 years beyond that. It's tremendous.
Yeah. Well, and the last point I'd make is just, we have never required offsets in committee. We've always allowed bills to pass committee without offsets. So there is not a new standard that's going to be developed now in terms of that policy.
So are you willing to
No
still
requirement.
entertain the
No
discussion of possibly finding some acceptable bipartisan offsets before this comes to the House?
Yeah, I don't want to mislead you on that. My view is that we should not pay for extensions of current law with taxes other places in the economy. But anyway, I'm happy to recognize Mr. Thompson. If there's any further questions for Mr. Bartold, we can go to amendments.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I hopefully will only have a few questions. Mr. Bartold, I think you've sort of responded to this, but let me make sure I'm clear. This provision would add how much to the deficit?
On the green sheet, JCX 59, before you, we have our revenue estimate for this provision, and over the 10-year budget period, it would lose approximately $1.1 billion.
So $1.1 billion would be added to the deficit if this provision were enacted into law?
On offset, yes, that is correct, sir.
Do you have an idea? There are, what, 310 or 12 million Americans in this country. My understanding, there are about 160 million tax filers. In other words, because some members, some folks are families, so not everybody.
There's about 160 filing units
160
annually.
million.
160 million.
So about 160 million Americans file taxes for their family or others, for the 310 to 12 million Americans. How many people will benefit from this particular provision, which would add $1 billion to the deficit?
Well, remember, the $1 billion, Mr. Becerra, is over a 10-year period, so this would count a number of gifts across that period. I do not have an estimate of number of individuals. Generally, just to tell you how we've tried to estimate this in the past, is we have tried to track dollar values of contributions, not thinking that it was particularly important if there was three, $30 gifts as opposed to $190 gifts. That the thrust of the provision was in terms of total value of easement set aside. So I don't know that I could easily get you an estimate of numbers, but I will check with my colleagues and I can try and get back to you with that, sir.
Could you try to get back to me? But let me make sure. If we have 160 million tax filers, not 160 million families or tax filers will benefit from this provision, correct?
Oh, that's certainly the case.
Would it be fair to say that less than half of those filers would benefit from this provision?
Well, it would be a subset of the number of people who claim charitable deductions, and remember, under present law, basically 1/3 of taxpayers itemize. That's where you can claim a charitable deduction, and of that 1/3, not all make charitable deductions.
So we can say without hesitation that more than 2/3 of Americans who file taxes will not benefit from this tax break.
I think that's a fair estimate,
Okay.
Mr. Becerra.
And this bill would make that particular provision permanent. So instead of every year examining whether this provision has value, and there are many provisions that we're going to discuss that are temporary provisions. Some, I think all of us would agree, have great value. Some provisions we probably would look at and wonder if they're accomplishing their stated goal. But regardless of the merits of any particular provision, including this one for the moment, the bill itself that's before us would make this provision permanent, so it would never have to be examined to find out if it's achieving its stated purpose. Is that correct?
Well, to be fair to the committee, Mr. Becerra, it doesn't preclude the committee from undertaking its usual oversight activities, but it would not come up as part of an extenders package for a vote and discussion in committee.
That's a good point. So unless this committee did some oversight, it would automatically go through every year as a tax break.
It would be part of permanent law, charitable contribution.
So it would go through every year without examination unless we did oversight.
That's correct, sir.
Okay, appreciate that. Thank you very much. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, and I would just say a charitable contribution is, particularly of a conservation easement, is to the greater good in the environment, not simply, and I think the sponsors of the bill, both Mr. Thompson and Mr. Gerlach, would agree that it is not just to the individual taxpayer, but it is to society as a whole to preserve fragile land and watershed and other areas. But
Mr. Chairman, would you yield to?
yes.
I agree with you. I mean, I think I've been a sponsor of this provision myself, and that's, as I said, without discussing the substance or the merits of the proposals, I think the point here is about the fiscal responsibility of doing it this way. But thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Bartle.
Yeah. All right. If there are no further questions, I'll go to Mr. Thompson for amendments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have an amendment at the desk.
Mr. Chairman, I observe point of order.
Yes, if the gentleman would suspend while the amendment's being distributed. A point of order is reserved. Can I get one of them? Thanks. All right, Mr. Thompson's recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to repeat briefly some of the things that have been mentioned by myself and others today in regard to the program of conservation easements. It is an important program. It does have wide bipartisan support. I think Mr. Gerlach said over 200, I think probably 250. And it's been consistent. Mr. Chairman, when you and I carried this bill, we had over 300 co-authors on this bill. And the reason being is it's important, and it's important to everybody. Not only those who, individuals that get the specific benefit, the monetary benefit, but the societal benefits are important. And I think this is an important bill, and I'm very high on this measure, in part because of the policy stuff, but in large part because I've seen it work. I've been on the ground. I've stood on farms and ranches that are still in existence today because of conservation easements. The pressure from development would have otherwise taken them right out of the community. And that's not only bad for family farming, individual farmers and ranchers, but it's also bad for the communities in which those farms and ranches are located. Everybody will tell you, hunters, fishers, conservation groups, environmental groups, everybody understands the value of this particular program. And I just want to talk a little bit about the permanent versus temporary aspect of the bill. If anybody has ever tried to do a conservation easement, you have to have permanent to get it done. You can't do one of these in a year. It's hard to do one in 2 years. There are a lot of hurdles that need to be cleared in order to make sure that this resource is protected for future generations. So I commend the chairman for recognizing the value and the importance of making it permanent. But what I can't agree with is the idea that we would put this on the credit card and pass it on to our children and our grandchildren. Now, granted, it's only $1.1 billion, but that 1.1 is part of that $600 billion that this committee is participating in, moving out of the House, hopefully into law, and on the backs of our children and our grandchildren. And I can't go along with that. It's the right policy to pass it. It's the wrong policy to pass on this debt to future generations. So I would have this amendment to offer, if accepted, it would, by repealing provisions of 199, it would pay for this. And I think everybody agrees that it's an important bill. It should be paid for. And this is a small cost of making sure it's done, not only the right policy, but the right fiscal policy as well. And I would ask for the committee's support of this amendment.
Does the gentleman insist on his point of order?
I do, Mr. Chairman. I make a point of order to the amendment because it's not germane. The amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because the offset that denies a domestic manufacturing deduction to major integrated oil companies is not of the same subject matter as the substitute.
Does the gentleman from California wish to speak on germaneness?
Yeah, I believe it is germane, and if it's the ruling that that it's not, I would ask for a vote on that.
I'm prepared to rule the amendment is not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, by including subject matter that is not the same as the subject matter of the same amendment in the nature of a substitute. The point of order is sustained. The amendment is not in order.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to get a roll call on that.
Mr. Chairman, I move to table the appeal.
The question is on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to.
Chairman, I'd like a roll call vote.
The clerk will call the roll.
Thank you.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Aye. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Aye. Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin?
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel?
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott?
No.
Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal?
No.
Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? No. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Chairman Camp? Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
22 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 22 ayes and 14 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. Mr. Neal is recognized for an
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, as Mr. Kine indicated a few minutes ago, you certainly want to...
Could the gentleman suspend while the amendment's distributed? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I reserve point of order.
Oh, Jerry.
Point of order has been reserved.
I just have a meeting and I've got my head between my legs. I'll call you back. Yeah, I'm going to do it. It's just after 2 years. What?
Doing 2 years. Give Mr. Camp ranking. Thanks. It's 2 pages. Yes. This way, make Camp first. Why not? That's fine. Mr. Neal is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me pick up on what Mr. Kine had to say. I thought that the process that you embraced for tax reform was sound. I thought the inclusion of the Democratic minority was sound, and I thought that the rollout was sound, even if we couldn't find common ground on embracing the draft that you offered. Now, recognizing that consistency is not the first word that comes to mind when we discuss tax policy, we nonetheless are here today with this exercise because tax reform didn't go forward. That's really what we're doing here. And back to the framework of consistency that I offered a moment ago, I voted on the House floor last week to make the R&D tax credit permanent, knowing that it was unlikely that that was going to happen. But I also thought that moving the argument beyond 2 years to perhaps 7 years as it relates to R&D is a much more reasonable approach that I think would be more widely accepted. But we're going to be back here after the election doing essentially what we could be doing right now, and that is working on a 2-year extension package because tax reform didn't go forward. So I'm actually suggesting through this process that we buy some time to keep the goodwill that was generated going, to continue the back and forth, knowing that it's very hard to defend the current tax system. And I am suggesting with my amendment that we embrace Mr. Wyden's proposal in the Senate, Chairman Wyden's proposal, that we extend the special rule for contributions of capital gain real property made for conservation purposes for 2 years. And that's what Senator Wyden has done, and let me say that's what's going to happen even if we wait until after the election.
I would just say to my colleagues that if we were to adopt this and we were to ultimately pass a 2-year extension of the conservation easement, that would be a full budget window of conservation easements that have been unpaid for. And I think that what we really ought to do with an important policy like this is have it be permanent. So I don't
Chairman?
agree with the approach taken by the Senate.
Mr. Chairman.
And I hope that that is not what we do at the end of the year.
Might I ask you just to offer your opinion? What are the prospects, do you think, that after the election we're going to embrace the Wyden approach?
On conservation easement?
On tax extenders.
I think we have an opportunity to make some very critical tax policy permanent. I don't believe the House is simply going to rubber stamp the Senate.
I'm not suggesting we're going to rubber stamp the Senate. I'm suggesting that the thrust of what Wyden has done is what we're going to embrace after the election.
I do like the fact that...
I mean, I can do a gentleman's wager on it, a handshake.
Well, yeah, that sounds fine to me. But look, I think...
Well, you're much more in control of the outcome than I am on that.
I think since I'm going to be talking to Mr. Wyden after the election, you know, this is going to be something that's going to work out. At least the Senate did do something, which has been rare this year. So there is an opportunity at least to get between 2 years and permanent on these policies. We're somewhere in between that. But I would like to obviously get on the end of being permanent, given the arguments that were made on this particular provision and the importance and the planning and the long-term nature of it that other people have made in terms of this. But I would just urge a no vote on the amendment.
Can I speak on?
Mr. Levin's recognized on the amendment.
I hope the Senate will act before the election. And having talked at some length with Mr. Wyden, I hope there's a chance to do that. Because I think we should realize that if we don't act soon, essentially we're talking about a 1-year extension when it says it's 2 years. So to do it after the election is a 1-year extension. So I hope we don't assume that we're not going to act on the extenders until after the election. I also think it's going to be wise for us to take a hard look at each of the extensions. I don't think we should be a rubber stamp to the Senate. But it's one thing not to be a rubber stamp and another to pretend that what we're doing today is likely to occur, is responsible, and is consistent with the tax reform proposal that came out of the Republican ranks here on the Ways and Means Committee. So let's not be a rubber stamp. Let's hope the Senate acts. But let's not pretend that what we're doing today is anything either consistent with what's been proposed or is responsible fiscally. Because we're talking about $600 billion, plus, Mr. Chairman, I think you would acknowledge that there will be other extenders that have to be part of a package. And so we're not only talking about $600 billion, we're talking about $700 billion probably when you add all the other provisions, and maybe more than that, if we essentially take the path of making things permanent now without paying for them. So I think this amendment, we may not do it for each of these bills, but at least a few to point to what, Mr. Neal, you're trying to say, and that is, let's be realistic. Let's try to move action on the extenders that should be extended as soon as possible, and not simply kick the football down until after the election, or to throw a pass that it isn't even Hail Mary, it's irresponsible. You bet.
I would just say that, you know, I agree with Mr. Levin to the extent of I would like to actually act before the election, before the end of the year on these matters as well. But I don't think that we can do that without a committee position, without a House position on these matters. So that's why we're having these votes, because we do have to have a House position in order to get in the best position to talk to the Senate. I hope we can do that before the end of the year. I think, actually, I agree with that completely. I think Mr. Gerlach is seeking recognition.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a moment to comment on the amendment, if I can. This is a really important committee meeting relative to what we think the permanent tax code ought to look like, what long-term policy ought to look like. And no one around here can look in the crystal ball and figure out what Chairman Wyden's going to come up with in 2 months, 3 months, by the end of the year, what will be agreed to between Mr. Wyden and his committee and the Senate leadership compared to what would be agreed to here in the House and with the White House. Here we have an opportunity to make permanent in the tax code a very important provision that goes into the decision-making that so many people have to engage in just to come up with one conservation easement transaction. As was alluded to by the gentleman from California, these transactions can take years to put in place because they're not just about the tax code, it's also about the other ingredients that will go into the deal. It might be some county preservation money, might be some local municipality money, might be some help and support from the local land trust or conservancy. And to get all those parties and all those players at the same time coming together with a very helpful tax code is what many times puts that transaction over the hump and into reality. So here we have an opportunity today to make permanent the tax code, to take away that uncertainty, to take away from that unpredictability, that those people that do the work in the field, so to speak, every day, they have to deal with. And so, to me, to think about what Chairman Wyden is going to be doing in a couple months or what the Senate leadership might be doing in a couple months really misses the point. The point here, we can only do one thing with our power as a committee today, and that's decide what a provision in the tax code ought to be and whether it ought to be permanent or not. We have an opportunity to make it permanent. We have an opportunity to green light a lot of these projects for the future in our areas, and I think we ought to take that opportunity and pass the provision as presented by the chairman and oppose the amendment. So I thank the chairman.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Neal.
Close?
To close on your amendment.
Mr. Chairman, once again, I'm sorry, I'll yield to Mr. McDermott when I finish, if I could. Okay. The policy is not in dispute. The process is. And that's what brought us here today, the failure of tax reform. And the notion or the argument today, after 3 years, that we're going to piecemeal approach this is highly unrealistic. And I'm simply suggesting that the Senate has already moved. It's not the suggestion that we're going to buy into everything that they do, but they are the ones that have put down a mark. And they've moved the process. So again, what you're offering with Mr. Thompson today is not something that we're arguing about. We're arguing about this process that brings us together at this kind of ill-considered moment to do what we could have done with tax reform and then given long-term predictability to the code. And with that, I would yield to Mr. McDermott.
Thank you, Mr. Neal. The issue that, to add some strength to Mr. Neal's argument, when we wait until the lame duck session to make decisions on this, we put the IRS in a situation where they have 1 month before the paper's supposed to go out, and people are supposed to begin fixing their taxes. We make an impossible situation for the IRS by waiting this long and making this decision about something which is clearly not going to pass. Mr. Wyden's already put out a proposal which tells you that we ought to be at the table negotiating, not passing pieces of legislation like this that have no chance whatsoever of going through. And I think that that's why Mr. Neal's amendment is a much better way to go. Say, we've got a place to start, Mr. Wyden. Let's start the negotiations now, rather than on the 15th of December, when we're all wanting to go home for Christmas. We'll still be here on this issue the way we're approaching it right now.
Yeah, I might just say that the Senate hasn't acted. The committee has. But the Senate hasn't passed anything with regard to extenders. So, and let me also point out that this is not a failure of tax reform. This is incremental progress on tax reform. And the House has acted on a permanent extender on research and development. And 62 Democrats supported that effort. So we are making progress on tax reform. It may not be in a complete bill, but this is incremental progress on that. So are there any further, is there anyone seeking recognition on this amendment? If not, we'll, the question is, on agreeing to the amendment offered by the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, all those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. A roll call is demanded. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson? Mr. Johnson, no. Mr. Brady? Mr. Brady, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, no. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, no. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, no. Mr. Bustani? Mr. Bustani, no. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, no. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach, no. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, no. Mr. Buchanan? Mr. Buchanan, no. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, no. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, no. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, no. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, no. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, no. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, no. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, no. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, no. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, no. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Griffin, no. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, no. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Rangel, aye. Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, aye. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, yes. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, aye. Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz, aye. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, aye. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, aye. Mr. Nunez? Mr. Lewis? Mr. Pascrell?
I had this all mixed up.
Chairman Camp?
No.
Chairman Camp, no.
If the clerk, how is Mr. Blumenauer recorded?
Mr. Blumenauer is recorded as no. Oh, Mr. Blumenauer, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
10 yeses, 26 noes.
There being 10 ayes, 26 noes, the amendment is not agreed to. If there are no further amendments,
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment.
Mr. McDermott is recognized.
Mr. Chairman.
While the amendment's being passed out.
I would reserve point of order.
Point of order has been reserved.
this. Yeah. Yes, yeah.
I want to get record on record.
Mr. McDermott is recognized on his amendment.
Mr.
5 minutes.
Chairman, sometimes the rules around here are a little bit hard to understand, but I think we're getting the picture. Every week or so, we have a meeting where we bring out some tax extenders chosen by the majority, and we vote on them, and we don't have any opportunity to make suggestions about what would happen. Everybody on this dais, or most everybody on this dais, represents a state in which there's an income tax. They deduct their income tax from their federal tax when they file in the spring of every year. Those of us who come from states without income taxes but have high sales tax have been, by a tax extension every year, been given the right to deduct our sales tax. Now, that's only fair. And if we don't do it, millions of taxpayers living in states without an income tax will pick up a $3.3 billion tax increase because we failed to extend this exemption, because they cannot claim it from their income tax. Millions of middle-class families. We're going to make a big, we're going to give an extension here to people at the top end at the end of the day, but millions of middle-class people in Washington, Texas, Nevada, Florida, Tennessee, South Dakota, Wyoming, and Alaska will pay major increases in their income tax because of our failure to extend this tax deduction. For example, in Washington State, the sales tax exemption saves Washington residents who claim the deduction $2,100 a year. Mr. Chairman, I know this will be ruled non-germane. I'm not stupid. I've been here. I've watched the game. I know the rules. But the people of my state need to know when the committee will take this issue up and where the members of this committee stand. And I would appreciate a timetable from you as to when you're going to bring out another 6 tax extenders. We only have 15 working days left till the end of July. So we don't have much time, and I would like to know when it's going to come up and when we're going to have an opportunity. I move the amendment. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order to the amendment because it's not germane. The amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because the offset that denies the domestic manufacturing deduction to major integrated oil companies is not the same subject matter as the substitute.
Does the gentleman from Washington State wish to be recognized on germaneness?
Mr. Chairman, I would only say this. If you write a bill tight enough, you can make everything non-germane, but the question still remains to be answered. When will it be germane to give fairness to the people of Texas, Washington, Florida, Wyoming, Tennessee, and others so that they can have the same advantage on their tax statements that those who come from states with income tax have? I don't see any reason why a tax bill can't have another tax provision, another tax extenditure added to it, except if you want to write it so tightly that you can't put anything else on it. That's what the game here is today. Write them so tight that nobody can add anything to them. That's why I object to the chairman's ruling.
Well, I haven't ruled yet. I'm prepared to rule. The amendment is not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, including subject matter that is not in the same as the subject matter of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. Yes.
I appeal the ruling of the chair.
I move to table the appeal.
The question is on the motion to table the appeal of the chair's ruling. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion to table is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been requested. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye.
How am I recording?
The gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel. Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Neal. No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra. No. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz. Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin, yes. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Doggett. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Pascrell. Chairman Camp. Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 14 noes, the motion to table is agreed to. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purposes of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 2807 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed signify by saying no. No. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson. Aye. Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady. Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel. Nope. Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott. No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal? Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pasquarell? Mr. Crowley? Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Ryan? Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Pasquarell? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 2807 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objections, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Schock and Mr. Blumenauer to make permanent the rule allowing certain tax-free distributions from individual retirement accounts for charitable purposes. Mr. Schock, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Chairman Camp. I want to first say thank you for the deliberate approach you're taking to consider these tax extenders, and I want to thank you for scheduling the H.R. 4619 for today's markup. The IRA charitable distribution incentive was established as a temporary provision of the Pension Protection Act of 2006. Several times since then, this provision has expired and been reinstated by Congress, most recently in the American Taxpayer Relief Act that we passed in 2012. The time has come to make this temporary provision permanent. By supporting this measure, we will strengthen our nation's network of charities that fight on the front lines against poverty, homelessness, illness, and illiteracy, and hunger in communities throughout the United States and also around the world. Many of my constituents and many public charities in my district in the state of Illinois have benefited from this tax incentive. In the first 2 years that Congress made the option available, more than $140 million were donated to public charities in the United States. Since that time, hundreds of millions more have been committed. That's why organizations like the American Red Cross, the American Heart Association, the Salvation Army, and United Way Worldwide support this legislation. In Illinois, the Jewish Federation of Metropolitan Chicago has raised more than $11 million from nearly 1,000 IRA gifts since 2006. And in my district, organizations like the Boys and Girls Club of Bloomington Normal, Peoria's Health Center for Healthy Living, and the Community Foundation of Central Illinois all stand to benefit from making this provision permanent. Simply put, the IRA charitable rollover is good for donors, good for our nation's nonprofit community, and good for U.S. taxpayers. Every dollar that is voluntarily given to charity means one less dollar U.S. taxpayers must spend to meet the same basic human needs through a government program. In fact, when government has failed or been slow to respond to these needs, it's our nation's charities who mobilize armies of mercy ready to step in and help. They are often the first to respond and the last to leave, a fact we've seen clearly in recent years. Since 2006, much has happened in our nation that tested the mettle of our people. The financial collapse of 2008 left millions unemployed and entire communities completely destroyed. But charities were there to provide job training, home mortgage assistance, and help with the utilities. When devastating tornadoes blew through Oklahoma City, or in my district, Washington, Illinois, and elsewhere, charities were there at once to help rebuild whole communities and restore the shattered lives. And when earthquakes hit places like Haiti and Japan, killing hundreds of thousands and leaving countless behind as widows and orphans, it was American charities who were there with water, food, and physical, emotional, and moral support that made a difference. Last year, charitable giving in the United States grew by 4.9%, topping $316 billion just from the U.S. Globally, the United States gives more than any other country, according to the World Giving Index of 2013. That's because at the bottom of every American heart is an acute awareness that we have a responsibility to help others. It has been said that no man ever becomes poor by giving too much. The same can be said of a nation. No nation has ever gone bankrupt because it encouraged its people to give. H.R. 4619 will strengthen the U.S. tax code, empower our people to give more generously, and provide our nation's charities with the resources they need to continue the good work of helping others, and they should be able to do this on a permanent basis. With that, I hope I can earn the support of my colleagues on the committee, and I yield back to the chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Levin is recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
I yield to Mr. Blumenauer.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Levin. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree with much of what my colleague from Illinois and co-sponsor of this legislation has said. I would elaborate for a moment in terms of some of the unique problems that are faced by older Americans. Perhaps the advantage of this provision is that it's available regardless of whether the taxpayer itemizes his or her returns. Many of our older constituents who would take advantage of this have paid off their home mortgages, no longer itemize tax returns. And the mandatory distribution element of their IRA can trigger a significant tax burden, even if they end up donating the money to charity. The rollover provision removes these negative tax consequences and encourages Americans, as my colleague said, to give back to their communities. And it is frustrating to have it seesaw back and forth between extension and expiration. The mandatory IRA withdrawals cannot be retroactively rolled over to a charity. Thus, like several individual provisions, it can't be fixed by retroactively renewing the tax extender. So it ends up in a result in a loss of donor support for charities. But that said, I mean, I support this. We have an opportunity as a committee. This is one that all of us could get behind. This should be an opportunity to unite to pass it, make it permanent, provide that support for the seniors. But by rolling it into an almost $300 billion grab bag, and we don't know what's going on further, that's frustrating because we're not. We would have an opportunity to drive policy. It would not be that hard to work together to offset. It muddles the message of the committee, making it look like we're divided when, in fact, we don't need to be. And when the appropriate time comes, Mr. Chairman, I would offer an amendment to at least pay for it for a couple years. I'd like to get to a point where we're dealing with the items that enjoy virtually universal support, so not have arbitrary divisions and increases to the deficit. But with that, I will yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4619, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will again turn to Mr. Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and we'll have questions after his presentations.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, members have before them Joint Committee Document JCX 55, which describes the underlying text of H.R. 4619, and the green sheet, JCX 61, which is the Chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Just by way of quick background, under a provision of law which expired December 31st, 2013, taxpayers who are older than age 70 and a half could make a distribution of less than $100,000 from an IRA directly to a charitable organization, and such distribution would be excluded from their gross income for purposes of the individual income tax. The proposal before you would reinstate that provision effective for the current tax year and make the provision permanent. That concludes my brief description.
All right. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold? Mr. Becerra.
Mr. Bartold, thank you again for the description. Can you tell us again how much this particular provision would add to the deficit over 10 years?
Mr. Becerra, as we report on JCX 61, the estimated revenue loss from this provision is approximately $8.4 billion over the 10-year budget period.
So $8.4 billion that is not covered and would add to the deficit. Do you have an idea of how many tax filers, of the 160 million or so Americans who file taxes, what percentage of those tax filers would benefit from this provision?
I do not have that at my fingertips again. I apologize. I can work with my colleagues, and I'll get that supplemental information to you.
I appreciate that. And again, thanks for getting us the number, but my sense is, since you have to be a certain age, do you say 70 years of age?
Over age 70 and a half.
Over 70 and a half years of age to be able to
Which is the same age that one has to take required distributions from an IRA or a qualified plan.
So only those people who are 70 and a half years of age or older can participate in making this type of contribution. And obviously, so the people who receive the contribution will benefit from that. But clearly, most Americans are not over the age of 70 and a half.
No, sir, they're not.
Okay. So I'm assuming that of the 160 million filers, only a small number of them will be able to benefit from this tax break.
Certainly less than 50%.
Okay.
And again, said, we'll provide some supplemental information for you and the rest of the committee.
And with that, again, speaking to the merits of the proposal, because many of us may support the notion of having someone who has the ability, the capacity, financial capacity, to use that IRA, not for himself or herself in retirement, but to help a good cause. Regardless of the merits of the proposal, since it adds over $8 billion to the deficit, and it benefits only a fraction of the American taxpaying public, this bill would make that provision, whether it's good or bad, permanent, so that every year we don't have to have this conversation like this to discuss whether or not it's a good provision to have in our tax code. Is that correct?
It would make the provision of prior law permanent.
Permanent. So we would not have to discuss it in order for it to be used every year by tax filers.
That's correct, sir.
Appreciate that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, I do want to point out that the committee did receive testimony from Diana Aviv, President and CEO of Independent Sector, who testified in the committee on February 14th, 2013. And this is one of the provisions we've had a lot of support for and feedback from. She said, during the first 2 years the IRA charitable rollover option was available, it prompted more than $140 million in charitable donations, with a median gift just under $4,500. Beneficiaries have included social service providers, religious organizations, cultural institutions, and schools, organizations that benefit communities and improve lives every day. So I think when we look at which taxpayers are taking advantage of this, it doesn't tell the full story about what a charitable contribution like this does. And the other point I would make is that, again, if this were extended for 2 years, it would be a budget window. So we have, in effect, over time, made this policy permanent by continual extensions. And I think, as Mr. Blumenauer pointed out, it's important to note that when there's a gap, as there has been on this, I think, terrible policy of temporary tax initiatives, you can't make it up. And we can't go back and necessarily have people participate who otherwise wouldn't.
Mr. Chairman?
Are there any further questions?
Yes, Mr. Chairman.
You want to comment? Fine. Okay. Mr. Rangel's recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I really don't think it's fair for the American taxpayers or this committee to be talking about a bill which would be costing $2.8 billion over 10 years, even though the 2-year extension is closer to $2 billion. Just saying that something is a charity doesn't mean that it's the correct thing to do. And it would seem to me that with all the fraud that is out there and the deficit everly increasing, that this committee would have a responsibility before we make such a provision permanent to be prepared to take testimony to make certain that the objectives in which this provision was created is still in effect. I know most of you watch television, and you can see the ideas that they're providing, that if you want to help a veteran, or if you want to help someone with pets, and clearly you can tell by their short life that they're frauds. And while all of us feel good about making contributions to what we think are worthy clauses, how in the world can we ever explain to our voters that we've just decided, purely for political reasons, that we got to present this before this committee and decides who voted for charity and who didn't vote for charity? There comes a time that politics has become so unfair when it comes to the institutions that are respected by all Americans and rely totally on our contributions. So I feel as awkward as the majority intended for me to feel, but I just think in terms of the fairness of the issue and the good that comes out of charitable organization, that is not fair to them. I yield back the balance of my time.
All right. Are there any further questions? Mr. Blumenauer has an amendment. You're recognized. If you could suspend while the amendment, the clerk will distribute the amendment if you could suspend while the amendment's being distributed.
And I would serve a point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. Mr. Blumenauer is recognized for 5 minutes on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't want to belabor this. I've indicated why I think this is important. I would personally think that we're better off being able to pay for this for the next couple of years and deal with this in the context of sorting through the ones that we agree with, that we can pay for, that don't necessarily have to divide us, and I would respectfully request that it be approved.
All right. The gentleman from Texas is recognized on his point of order.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order with the amendment because it's not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because the offset that denies the domestic manufacturing deduction to major integrated oil companies is not of the same subject matter as the substitute.
All right. Mr. Blumenauer is recognized on germaneness.
I've got the point.
All right.
I've made mine. I'll move on.
All right. I'm prepared to rule the amendment is not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, by including subject matter that is not the same as the subject matter of the amendment in the nature of a substitute.
Okay.
Are there any further amendments? If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. 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 Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I'll now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4619 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is unfavorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. No. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Bustani. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Aye. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. The gentleman is not recorded. Mr. Ryan, aye.
Am I recorded?
The gentleman is not recorded.
Aye.
Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel.
Nope.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott.
Nope.
Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Neal. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra.
No.
Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett.
No.
Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson.
No.
Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson.
No.
Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer.
No.
Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, no.
Be for any of them.
Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Crowley, no. Ms. Schwartz. Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Pascrell. Chairman Camp.
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 14 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 14 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4619 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Reed to permanently extend and expand the charitable deduction for contributions of food inventory. Mr. Reed, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to my colleagues on the committee. In my district this past week, I heard from food bank volunteers, farmers, small business employees, restaurateurs about the positive impact this proposed bill we have before us today will have on their ability to donate food to the food banks and help their neighbors in need. To me, this is a fundamental question of fairness and caring for our community. In many ways, America is the land of plenty, but for 1 in 6 people in the United States, hunger is a very real struggle. Many people believe that the problem associated with hunger are confined to small pockets of society, certain areas of the country, or certain neighborhoods, but the reality is much different. Right now, millions of Americans are at risk of hunger. These are often hardworking adults, children, and seniors who simply cannot always make ends meet and may be forced to go without food. The Fighting Hunger Incentive Act incentivizes restaurants, grocery stores, farmers, and other businesses to contribute their excess inventory to local food banks and pantries by permanently extending the food inventory donation tax provision. Instead of wasting perfectly good food, the goal is to have it donated by providing a tax deduction over the cost of goods sold if the food is donated to a charitable organization. This provision helps offset the additional cost of packing and transporting the food for that donation. Making the provision permanent would increase donations of excess food inventory, provide food for the needy, reduce waste in our landfills, and provide parity between the different businesses types that the law now treats. I'm happy to be able to promote legislation that brings together businesses and charitable groups to care for those in need in our community. It is only fair that we pass this legislation to stand with our local communities and help our local food banks do what they do best, and that is taking care of the most needy among us. And so I ask my colleagues to join in support of this permanent extension and move forward to its final adoption on the floor. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin, you're recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
I think this bill illustrates vividly what's at stake here, and so let me speak briefly to it. I support this bill in the sense I support the program. Indeed, Mr. Gerlach, you and I introduced the identical bill. And we've been working on this issue for years. And so there's a depth of feeling about this. All of us have been to pantries to see how they're growing short of food. We all have seen the value of having donations from the various supermarkets and also farmers. So there is no question here about the value of this provision. There's also serious question as to why we're doing this, why we're making it permanent, why we're doing so as part of a structure that would add another close to $300 billion to what is already passed here, $300 billion, with a couple more, probably hundreds of billions coming along. So I just have to continue to ask, why in the world are we doing this? It can't be to set ourselves up for a conference when the Senate passes its bill. This provision, the food donation provision, is going to be in any conference report that comes out. We know that. And making it permanent isn't going to affect what comes out of a conference. And I don't say this to embarrass you, Mr. Chairman. I really don't. We've known each other a long time.
Well, you don't need to say it then.
No, I won't. I don't want anybody to think that. But in your proposal, you repeal this provision. And so now, and so I want to reemphasize, I'm not saying this to embarrass you. I want to drive home a point. You made a serious effort. We didn't continue these bipartisan efforts after the groups that we set up, but that was a good beginning. But you, in your document, repeals this. And so now to make this permanent, just kind of plucking it out of the extenders, and it's an important provision, is a mistake. So it isn't consistent, it isn't responsible, and it's not going to lead to our serious consideration of tax reform. Indeed, it kind of is a step backwards, because it says what you suggested be repealed, we make permanent. So I'm going to vote no without any hesitation. And I will be able to go back to the groups that the staff back home and I have worked on and be able to say clearly why I voted no. Because I think people send us here to advocate for a specific provision, but to do so in a way that takes into consideration other needs and is fiscally responsible. We have not considered most of the provisions that are in the tax extender bill. And some, like new markets and the work opportunity credit, are vitally important to us. And we're just proceeding as if we're not going to take them up, or if we do, it's going to add another $100 billion when we put everything together. So I guess we're kind of going through the motions here. And you all are going to vote yes, and I think my colleagues will vote no. But let no one think that there's any hesitation about the merits of this program. But this bill, the way it's put together, has immense demerits to it. And so I can't allow an approach that is so wrong and is dangerous in terms of programs we care about. I can't let that move me to say yes on this. So I very much urge you to reconsider, and if not, you'll leave us no consequences but to vote no. I yield back.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4719, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Again, Mr. Bartold will turn to you to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and we'll have questions after your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, the members have before them Committee JCX 58, which describes the underlying text of H.R. 4719, and the green sheet JCX 64, which describes the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute. By way of basic background, I think it's useful to think of three components of the bill before you. Under present law, there are generally, if gifts of property are made from inventory, the taxpayer may claim the basis in the property as a charitable deduction. There is, as part of permanent law, special rule that applies to C corporations in the case of certain types of gifts of inventory, among them gifts of food inventory, that permits the deduction claimed for a C corporation to be the lesser of the taxpayer's basis plus half of the appreciated gain, or twice the basis of the property. Under a provision of law which expired December 31st of 13, that same rule with respect to food inventory was extended to businesses who pay taxes as other than a C corporation. So, for example, sole proprietorships, S corporations. And the bill before you today would make that special provision permanent law, and in addition would make some modifications. One modification would increase the annual percentage limitation from 10% of, for a charitable gift of this sort, from 10% of income to 15%. A second modification would apply in the case of taxpayers other than C corporations to allow them in certain circumstances to treat the basis of their food inventory as equal to 25% of the fair market value. A third modification is that determining fair market value would be made notwithstanding certain standards that the taxpayer might have for what they would permit to be sold to their customers would be excluded from the standard of determining what the fair market value is. The proposal would be effective for contributions after December 31st of 2013. That concludes my brief description, Mr. Chairman.
Well, thank you. I think particularly this is important because this would represent the sixth two-year policy of this kind, which is well past the budget window. I think this cries out to be made permanent because of the perishable nature of food. which has meant for the past 6 months, pass-through entities have not been able to use this provision to donate to food pantries and the like. And the testimony we had before the committee, again from Diana Aviv, who was the CEO of Independent Sector, she said the expanded incentive has been vital as community food pantries and other meal providers attempt to keep pace with the growing number of Americans who go to bed hungry every night. So I think this one, I hope that that my friends on the other side have not just all gotten together and said, we're going to vote no on everything. I hope this particular one is one that you'll take a close look at because it has been extended up to the budget window, so without being paid for. So in a sense, we've said it's permanent policy here. This is one I think that is particularly relevant for moving forward. I think Mr. Doggett has some questions.
I do.
For Mr. Bartol.
And Mr. Chairman, I am pleased to hear you say that because I know you rejected this concept in your comprehensive bill that you presented to the committee just a few weeks ago. I do support the concept of incentivizing businesses to donate food to food banks and similar organizations, but I do have some specific questions about this bill. If I understand, a business can obtain an enhanced tax deduction for up to twice what it paid for the product that it's donating if that product qualifies.
That's correct.
And with reference to what food qualifies, under the statutory definition, it must be, quote, apparently wholesome food. Isn't that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And there is not any requirement that the food actually be wholesome or nutritional. It just has to be, quote, apparently wholesome, right?
Let me check with my colleague briefly.
Well,
I'm not sure how the IRS has interpreted that.
With reference to the statute which defines the act, isn't it correct that a bag of Halloween candy that needs to get off the shelf before Thanksgiving qualifies for this deduction?
Well, if you're asking if there's a nutritional standard in terms of sugars or fats or something.
If I might, I think I have the answer there.
Well, I want
find in statute what apparently.
Yes, I've got the statute,
is.
and the statute permits to qualify for this, a bag of Halloween candy that someone wants to get off the shelf before Thanksgiving, or a bag of Valentine's candy that they want to get off before they put on the sugared Easter eggs, or a squash bag of Twinkies, or a stale bag of potato chips, or a sugary soft drink that's about a year over its sell date. All of those things qualify as apparently wholesome food because there's no requirement that the food be actually wholesome. Is there in the statute, the specific words of the statutes, Mr. Barthol?
Well, Mr. Doggett, as I said, the statute does not place a nutritional standard.
Right.
So
It calls
yes,
for
it's true.
apparently
High
wholesome,
sugar,
not wholesome food. And in fact, at this very moment, other Republican colleagues over in the House Appropriations Committee are attempting to approve a major rollback of healthier school lunches at the time we consider expanding a subsidy for foods that are both healthy and unhealthy at a time that we have a virtual epidemic of diabetes and increasing concern about childhood obesity. Now, this bill, if I read your green sheet correctly, comes out for an average cost of about $200 million a year. That's what we're being asked to pay for this. I don't know how much of the $200 million is stale potato chips and Twinkies and sugary drinks and candy, but a portion of it is, and I think we have to make choices as to whether we ought to be subsidizing those things or we ought to be using that to improve our schools and for other purposes. This bill is also presented as part of an apparently wholesome tax package. But in fact, the insistence on borrowing another $600 billion of business tax breaks will do our economy what Twinkies do for nutrition. I don't believe there's merit to such a broad deduction. I believe that had we gone through the normal legislative process, that there's near unanimity, at least until the chairman put out his broad tax proposal that eliminated this provision, and that for C corporations also, that there would be broad support for this, but there would be an opportunity to try to craft a more targeted deduction just as if we were talking about a direct spending program, we would be looking to cut out waste and inefficiency. Well, I think this is basically a good concept, but it's accompanied by considerable waste and inefficiency that we ought to be dealing with rather than writing that into permanent law as this bill does. And so I have support for the concept, but reservation about the specifics of this bill and how it not only encourages the donation of healthy food, but something that is definitely not wholesome, only appears to be, much as this bill appears to be something that will help the economy as a whole, but clearly is neither wholesome nor healthy for the American economy. And I yield back.
Mr. Chairman? Mr. Griffin.
Mr. Chairman, I think that the standard here is one not too different from that applied to food stamps. It is interesting to hear my colleague come out in favor of excluding some of these foods from food stamp purchases because it's basically the same standard. So that's a conversation that we can have at another time, because I didn't realize that there was such broad support on that side of the aisle to limit food stamp purchases. But it's the same standard.
Will the gentleman yield?
Sure.
Just to my colleague from Texas, I hope the colleague does realize that some of this food that you're referencing that is not wholesome is utilized by food banks and other entities, charitable organizations, for children and their birthday parties. So if you really want to get this to the face of the people you're going to impact by trying to regulate a big, bureaucratic, one-size, mandated type of menu, understand you will impact other people, and you will impact children and their birthday celebrations, and I just don't think the gentleman from Texas wants to do that. And so with that, I yield back.
Mr. Barthold, I believe the word wholesome food is a term of art, and I believe it is found in FDA regs, is it not?
No.
FDA, I'm not familiar enough with FDA regs.
And I believe it's defined in the statute as well.
Well, it is, as Mr. Doggett and you have both noted, it is defined in the statute, and it's food intended for human consumption, meeting quality and labeling standards that may be imposed by the federal, state, and or local laws.
Will you read the rest of that definition?
Do you have? I have the time.
Would you yield?
I'm happy to yield to you when I'm done
surely.
talking to him. So this is a definition in statute.
It's defined by cross-reference to some of the statute governing ag regulations, Mr. Chairman. But
yes, and I believe it's also found in FDA. Are you aware of that, or is that?
I have to double check. I don't doubt. I don't doubt it. We will double check, and we'll get the full cross-reference in the site, and we'll provide that to all the members.
Mr. Doggett.
I would just note, Mr. Chairman, that 42 U.S.C. 1791b2, the rest of the definition where Mr. Barthold stops, is regulations, even though the food may not be readily markable due to appearance, age, freshness, grade, size, surplus, or other conditions. So the expired label, the twisted bag of Twinkies, all of these things are no excuse for providing the deduction. It applies to all of those things, and I just think it could be more narrowly tailored.
Yeah, I thought Twinkies had a half-life longer than most of us at this table, but
probably true.
Anyway,
it's covered either way.
All right. All right. Are there any further questions? Yes, Mr. Davis.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Barthold, can you tell us whether or not this bill will help the long-term unemployed?
Well, a substantial intention of this is to create an incentive for businesses in the food industry when they have excess inventory, or even perhaps if they don't have excess inventory, to consider donating that to charitable organizations that are whose exempt purpose is to provide food to those in need. So I would infer from that long-term unemployed would be among people who could benefit from food pantries and operations of these charities, who would be recipients of the inventory that would be given and for which the taxpayers could claim the benefits of this provision.
Well, thank you very much. And, Mr. Chairman, I have long supported the tax incentive for businesses to deduct charitable contributions of food inventory. Indeed, I have a bill to expand the deduction for non-C Corp, as does the bill under consideration. The food inventory deduction allows us to help stock America's food banks and feed the hungry. Of course, I come from an area, and in Chicago, 1 in 6 people, including children, do not know where their next meal is coming from. In addition to advancing charitable donations of food and passing hundreds of billions of dollars in tax cuts for big corporations, our committee should be prioritizing the permanent extension of the Earned Income Tax Credit to help the working poor afford food and other basic needs for their families. We should be prioritizing the new market tax credits to help distressed communities so the hungry will have strong communities and good jobs. And although I strongly support incentivizing charitable donations of food inventory, I do not support passing unpaid-for permanent and piecemeal tax breaks while the needs of our most vulnerable citizens, like the long-term unemployed and working poor, go unmet. I thank you and yield back.
All right. Are there any further questions? There being no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4719 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan. Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Aye. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Aye. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel.
No.
Mr. Rangel, no. Mr. McDermott. No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Neal. No. Mr. Neal, no. Mr. Becerra. Mr. Doggett. No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley.
Yes, they do.
Ms. Schwartz. Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Becerra. Mr. Crowley. Chairman Camp.
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 13 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 13 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4719 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views. So ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Kelly to allow individual charitable contributions to be made through April 15 of the following year. Mr. Kelly, you're now recognized for an opening statement on this bill.
I thank you, Chairman. I thank you for bringing up this bill. This is pretty much a common sense thing. This is so basically American. Well, I don't think there's another country in the world, and even in the history of the world, that has given more, its citizens have given more to charity than America. And this piece allows people to have up until April 15th of the following year the opportunity to deduct from their income tax, the previous year's income tax, their contributions. And I hope that we don't get into this situation where we keep footballing this thing back and forth about why we're doing it. This is just simple. This is common sense. I don't know why we have to make it some kind of a political game about why are we trying to do things to help people out charitably and all of a sudden turn it into some kind of a political bend. That's not what it's about. It's about Americans helping Americans. 88% of American families make charitable contributions. There's nobody else in the world, not in the history of the world, that have had this heart that we have as Americans. So I've only been here 3.5 years, and I can see why the American people sit back and scratch their heads. So we'll say, well, wait a minute. This isn't exactly the way I like to roll this out, so as much as I like to give money, as much as I like to help other people, I've got to somehow put some kind of a political curve on it, because it's not good enough the way it goes out. It's not good enough just to have a good heart. It's not good enough just to open your wallet and help people who need it. All this piece does is allow people up until April 15th of the following year to continue to make charitable contributions. It's just who we are. It's so basic. And as I said earlier, this gets very confusing for me to sit and watch this, and I'm sure for the people at home, they sit back and really wonder about what in the heck are they talking about? We have the opportunity to do things to help people, and yet because of some kind of a political ideology, we don't want to do it. We want to try and morph it into something different. I just don't get that. And as far as things being paid for, if there wasn't a concern for 30-some years for this to be paid for, why all of a sudden now is this great thing about you got to pay for this stuff? The other side of it is, quite frankly, as a taxpayer all my life, I get disappointed at the decisions that are made with my dollars, and saying, well, the problem is you're just not giving enough. You need to give more. I think this is a pretty basic piece of legislation, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you for bringing it forward, and I hope my colleagues feel the same way about this. This is quintessentially who we are as Americans and what we do as an American people, allowing people up to April 15th of the year following, when they would be filing their income tax, to still make a charitable deduction. That, to me, is just good common sense. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Levin's recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Well, I guess as ranking, it falls to me, Mr. Kelly, to try to state why we have concerns about this. It has nothing to do with politics, and it has really nothing to do with the importance of charitable contributions, which we very much support. The problem is this isn't an extender. It hasn't been in existence for 30 years. It hasn't been in existence at all. There have been a few times when there has been a specific event in the world where we extended the period, and I don't have at my fingertips, because this kind of came out of the blue, exactly what those occasions are, but I remember a few. But it was possible, because they were a specific event, to extend the period, because in terms of the administration of the code, and also from the purpose of the taxpayer, in terms of certainty, it was possible to do that. But now to say for all charitable contributions, we change from a calendar year to essentially a fiscal year, isn't something that is easy for the IRS to administer, and actually isn't even going to be so easy for the taxpayer to carry out. I did have a chance to talk to a CPA about this because I just thought we'd get a practical reaction. And he just emphasized how difficult it would be to implement this to make sure that the rules were being followed and there wasn't a mistakes made inadvertently, and perhaps in some cases less than inadvertently. We haven't had any hearings on this. And I just think in terms of the integrity of this committee, when we raise proposals like this, we should sit down and have a hearing and discuss the pluses and minuses of it. So there's no motivation here except to try to make sure that when we address proposals to change the code, that we have the necessary hearings and we have the necessary back and forth among us. That way, I think we'll improve the code. And it just doesn't meet that standard. It's not an extender. It's brand new in terms of a general policy. So I very much applaud your motivation. I just don't think we should kind of just take this up without the kind of serious consideration that is the very purpose of the Ways and Means Committee.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 3134, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offered an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance, along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read open for amendment at any point and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I will again turn to Mr. Barthold to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and we'll have questions after your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, JCX 54 describes the underlying text of H.R. 3134, and the green sheet JCX 60 describes the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. In short, this proposal permits individuals to elect to deduct for a taxable year charitable contributions made after the close of that taxable year, which for individuals is almost always the calendar year. But the contribution must be made no later than the due date without regard to any extensions for the individual's income tax return for the taxable year, so generally by April 15th. And the chairman's amendment would make clear that this is effective for elections made with respect to taxable years beginning after 2013. That concludes my description, Mr. Chairman. Happy to answer any questions the members might have.
Yes, and I would just say we did have a hearing on this matter. We had a hearing in February of 2013 on tax reform and charitable contributions, and we did receive testimony exactly on this point from Eugene Sturley of the Urban Institute, and quoting from him, he said, allowing donors to deduct gifts until the filing of a tax return or April 15 would produce very large bang per buck. So we have gotten a lot of positive feedback. Obviously, this was also contained in the discussion draft, which was released in February of this year, and I would just say that this, not that I have a lot of concern about the IRS, but this is not an additional burden for the IRS, and that they already do this for IRA contributions, so this is not necessarily a new effort they'd be undertaking. Are there any questions for Mr. Barthold?
Let me just comment. Excuse me. Yeah, please,
Mr. Becerra. Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Barthold, again, can you tell us how much this adds to the deficit?
Mr. Becerra, on JCX 60, we have our estimate of the revenue effects of the proposal as amended. We estimate that it would lose approximately $2.8 billion over the budget period.
So that's a $2.8 billion increase to the federal deficit over 10 years?
Yes.
So, okay, and if my tally is correct, if we include this with the other three bills that have been voted out, we're now at a total of about $14.5 billion unpaid for in tax breaks that would be added to the deficit.
Actually, I have to say that while your addition is correct, that wouldn't be the total of all three bills considered together, because since these are all charitable deduction provisions, there's interaction between them, and the estimates that I have provided to you individually are assuming that that's the only provision that we're considering with no other changes. So we have not considered these as a package.
Okay, so roughly about $14 billion in deficit.
That's probably fair, Mr. Becerra, yes.
Adding about $14 billion to the deficit. So far, we still have some other bills to go. You know, a billion here, billion there, pretty soon, real money. I'm sorry. Does the gentleman ask me to yield?
Yes.
Yes, I'll yield to Mr. Blumenauer from Oregon.
I just was struck by Mr. Kelly's talking about the United States being the most generous country in the history of the world. As we know, we as a country, in terms of our international contributions to international aid, we are really quite a ways down there in terms of per capita. And it took me about 14 seconds to go to Google and find that there are a number of indexes that indicate that there are other countries that are likewise generous. In fact, more people contribute than in the United States, and more people volunteer time. I'm not denigrating at all the charitable instincts of my constituents or anybody else, but to suggest that the United States is the most generous country in the history of the world flies in the face of some evidence that other countries are doing a pretty good job as well.
I thank the gentleman for that point. So, Mr. Bartow, let me make sure again. Roughly $14 billion would be added to the deficit if these three, plus this particular bill, were to become law without paying for it. Would have to be paid for, obviously, through other means, whether other Americans get their taxes increased or other Americans get their services cut. I'm assuming that because in order to take advantage of this particular tax break, you have to file for deductions, that this would also be a tax break that goes to only about a third, or only about a third of Americans who file taxes would be eligible to file for this particular tax break?
Generally, that would be true, although I think if you were considering the entire package, well, let me just leave it at that. That's, again, as I had noted earlier today, roughly 35% of filing units itemize, and to claim the charitable deduction, you itemize.
So if 35% of tax filers, Americans who pay taxes, file using the itemization category, if they happen to do this type of charitable contribution, they could. But obviously not everybody who files taxes using the long 1040 form necessarily will file for a tax break under this charitable deduction. So 35% is the number who file using the long form, but that doesn't mean that 35% of American taxpayers would actually get this tax break. And finally, once again, this bill would make this provision permanent in tax law, so we would not go through this process we're undergoing today of examining whether it has value to continue this particular tax break that goes to only a certain number of Americans.
Well, as I think the chairman pointed out, this is actually a new provision. This is not an expiring provision.
Well, that's right. That's an even better point. In other words, this has never been done before, and this would now provide a tax break to only a certain number of American taxpayers, and it would be done for the first time, but we'd be making it permanent without ever examining if it has value and it has merit. Again, not judging the value or merit, but we would be making this permanent without ever having an opportunity to examine if it was good tax policy. With that having said, and knowing that we're going to add more to the deficit with a couple of other bills to come, I will close with that and yield back the balance of my time.
Did you have a comment you wanted to make?
No, I was just going to observe the chairman's point that the committee did have some hearings on the general issue of charity and included this point.
And also the charitable working groups. Mr. Levin and then Mr. Kelly.
I just wanted to emphasize, we had a hearing on charitable contributions, but we really did not dig into the feasibility of this. And we should be doing that. whether it's possible to really administer this, both for the taxpayer in terms of making sure of the validity of the contribution deductions, and in terms of those who have to look at tax returns. I mean, we really should be spending some time looking into this. This is a new proposal. So to just say because someone at a hearing raised it as something that was positive, that's fine, but that isn't the way we should be conducting ourselves.
Mr. Kelly.
Thank you, Chairman. The real purpose is give Americans who want to be more generous with their own money 3.5 months to contribute to charities. Now, I don't know, Mr. Barthel, if we have the ability to determine, as we make these contributions to different charities, what effect it has overall lowering the cost to the average taxpayer to provide other benefits for people. I've watched what happens with the American people, and I am not confused about this at all when I talk about Americans being the most generous people in the world, having the largest hearts in the world. It would be hard for me to imagine, looking over the course of history, that anybody could look to any other place on the globe and say, you know what? America pales in comparison to what these people have done. And you can go back to whatever time period that you want to, and you can change it around and play with different figures to try and come up with something that maybe makes sense in a debate, but it doesn't make sense on the streets. We're the first responder to everything that happens in the world that is bad. We're the first ones there with the most. We've always been that way. It's just who we are. We've given our wealth and we've given the health of our country. We've sacrificed over 1.4 million people to defend freedom and liberty around the world. That's a hell of a contribution. And to somehow suggest that America isn't doing its part or doesn't do as much as other countries is absolutely hogwash. I, for one, will refuse to sit here and listen to, you know what, we think we're good, we're really not that good. I'm tired of this mea culpa act where we're always saying, oh my gosh, we're just not doing enough, we need to do more. There's nobody that does more for the world than America. We just do. We feed people, we provide medical assistance when people are in a bind, we show up every time there's a disaster. All we're doing here is allowing people another 3.5 months to look into their hearts and then remove from their wallets that which they want to do to help other people. That's just basically who America is, who America's always been. And why would we have a debate about, do we really, per capita, do as much as somebody else? I have no idea, in 15 seconds, how you come up with that statement. I'll give you 66 years of actually being on the surface of this globe and knowing who's always there and who always does the most. We sit in the same body representing the same people. I would never, ever suggest that the American people somehow don't measure up to any other country in the world or any other people in the world when it comes to charitable giving. 3.5 months extension to allow Americans who are going to pay their taxes to take some of that money and give it to a charity which they like to give it to, where they think it's going to be spent the best way, where they think it's going to be having the most impact. That is not an odd concept. That is American. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for bringing this piece forward, and I hope that we can come together and just do something that makes sense. I yield back.
I don't see anyone else seeking recognition. Are there any, if there are no further questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 3134 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is unfavorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
I ask for a roll call, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will call the roll.
Sorry, I didn't know that.
Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson.
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert. Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom. Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price. Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan.
Aye.
Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock. Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins. Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson. Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant. Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black. Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly. Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin. Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci. Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin.
No.
Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel. Mr. McDermott. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Neal. Mr. Becerra. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett. No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson. No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson.
No.
Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer.
No.
Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind. Mr. Pascrell. No. Mr. Pascrell, no. Mr. Crowley. Ms. Schwartz. Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Rangel. Mr. Lewis. Mr. Neal. Mr. Kind. Mr. Crowley. Mr. Neal. Mr. Kind. Mr. Kind, no. Chairman Camp. Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 12 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 12 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 3134 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. And without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views so ordered. The next order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Paulson and Mr. Davis to modify the tax rate for excise tax on investment income of private foundations. Mr. Paulson, you're now recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just thank you also for your continued dedication to having a very deliberative and thoughtful approach to tax simplification and tax reform, and for holding this markup today on H.R. 4691, the Private Foundation Excise Tax Simplification Act. I'd also like to thank my colleague, Mr. Davis, for serving as an original co-sponsor and for his efforts in championing this provision in prior Congresses. Private foundations make a world of difference to our communities. In my home state of Minnesota, over 1,400 foundations donate more than $1 billion annually to those in need. And nationwide, across the country, more than 81,000 foundations donated a total of almost $50 billion in 2011. As impressive as these figures are, they could easily be higher. Unfortunately, the tax code discourages large and increasing donations by private foundations. The net investment excise tax on private foundations has long been a source of confusion and frustration, especially for smaller foundations, which can have endowments that vary in size significantly from year to year. Today, these institutions face a very complex, two-tiered system of taxation that requires them to pay either a 1% or a 2% excise tax on their investment income. In order to qualify for the lower rate in a given year, a foundation must donate an amount greater than their average donations over the previous 5 years. This provides a perverse incentive for a foundation not to make a large donation in times when the need might be greatest, such as after a natural disaster or during tough economic times. A large donation at these times would significantly increase a private foundation's 5-year average and make it difficult to qualify for the lower excise tax in not only the next year, but in the following 4 years as well. This legislation eliminates the disincentive to make large donations in times of need by replacing the two-tiered system with the very simple, flat 1% excise tax on all private foundation investment income. This will simplify the tax planning process, especially for smaller foundations that now must spend valuable resources on accountants and lawyers instead of grantees. It will also ensure that charitable giving decisions are made based on the needs of our communities, not on the tax code. The bottom line is every dollar these organizations are paying in taxes means one less dollar for those in need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Davis is now recognized for the purpose of an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank the ranking member, Mr. Levin. And it's been my pleasure to actually join with Mr. Paulson in the introduction of H.R. 4691, the private foundation excise tax. I come from a state with a strong foundation base, and I've long championed improving the private foundation excise tax provisions to allow private foundations to better respond to the needs of their communities during economic troubles and natural disasters. Charitable foundations donate over $46 billion annually, and in Illinois alone, foundations give over $2.25 billion a year. Unfortunately, the current tax code provides a disincentive for foundations to increase their investments during times of economic turmoil. The current two-tiered rate means that if a foundation increases its giving in any year to meet heightened need due to natural disaster or the recession, the unfortunate result is higher taxes for 5 years. This bill removes this penalty for increased giving by creating a flat excise tax. When philanthropy thrives, communities thrive. And while I support revising the tax code to help private foundations aid their communities, I do not support passing unpaid-for, permanent, and piecemeal tax breaks while the needs of our most vulnerable citizens, like the long-term unemployed and working poor, go unmet. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and yield back.
Thank you. The committee will now proceed to the consideration of H.R. 4691, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. Without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. Again, Mr. Bartold, we'll turn to you to provide the technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and we'll have questions after your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The members have before them JCX 56, which describes the underlying text for H.R. 4691, and the chairman's amendment, the nature of a substitute, is described in the green sheet JCX 62. In short, as described by Mr. Paulson, present law provides for a two-tier system of tax, an excise tax on private foundation investment income, a 2% tier and a 1% tier, with the difference depending upon the past level of giving. The proposal before you replaces the two-rate system with a single rate of 1%. And this proposal would be effective upon the date of enactment, for taxable years, I'm sorry, beginning after the date of enactment.
All right. Thank you. Any questions for Mr. Bartold? Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Bartold, the Joint Committee on Taxation, you all came up with the estimate that this particular provision would increase the deficit by $1.9 billion over the next 10 years?
That's correct, Mr. Becerra. That's what we report on JCX 62.
Okay. And going through the same questions that I've gone through in the past, in this case, the tax filer that would get this tax break is not an individual, but a foundation.
That's correct. The tax is imposed upon the foundation.
Okay, so going through that same analysis that I went through before, actually I looked at some numbers. There are actually about 320 million people in this country now. 320 million people, Of those, you've got only about 160 of those 320 million, 160 million are tax filers because, again, you head of household, couples, et cetera. So you have fewer tax filers than you have people in the country. So you have about 160 million Americans who file taxes for their families and for themselves. Clearly, 160 million American taxpayers aren't going to benefit from this $2 billion in tax breaks.
Well, that's correct, Mr. Becerra. When we talk about the 160 million tax filers, we're referring to the individual income tax and or the payroll taxes. And this is the tax on investment income of private foundations, so it's a totally separate game.
And I would probably venture a guess to say that the number of tax filers or private foundations that will benefit by this tax break of $2 billion, which will be covered by the rest of us, is fewer than 1 million. I can't imagine there are 1 million private foundations.
Actually, there's a fair number of private foundations, but I will check the number of private foundations for you.
Please, that would be helpful if you would check the number, but I'm pretty sure, having gone through this assessment on some of the foundations in the past, that we won't find anywhere near 1 million private foundations who take advantage of this, but it will cost the American taxpayer $2 billion. And finally, like all these other provisions, whether you believe there are merits to giving a tax break costing $2 billion over the next 10 years to a small fraction of the American public is one thing, and we're not even necessarily debating that at this stage because we're already before the bill. We're not even having further hearings on this. But this change, if this bill were to pass and become law, would become permanent, and thereafter, each year thereafter, this tax break that would go to a fraction of tax filers, costing $2 billion over the next 10 years, would continue forward whether or not we agree or disagree on the merits of the proposal. Correct?
Mr. Becerra, this bill would change one permanent provision of law and replace it with another permanent provision. It's changing just the tax rate of a permanent provision of law. So the short answer is yes, but it's changing the tax rate of a permanent provision of law.
It's not a new provision.
No.
But it would permanently change it in a way that costs us $2 billion.
As I reported, our revenue estimate is a loss of $1.9 billion.
$1.9 billion. That's the loss, which means it adds to the deficit, the $1.9 billion, roughly $2 billion, that some other taxpayers are going to have to cover somehow, whether increased taxes for them or loss of services for them. One final point, because we've gone through this, $2 billion cost, fraction of Americans would benefit from this, and it becomes a permanent change costing $2 billion. At some point, we'll get to go through this in a more meaningful way, and I know the chairman was hoping to have a fuller discussion about not just this provision, but all provisions under the tax code, so we could come up with a way to reform our tax code so it could make sense. Rather than go through that process at this stage, we're just adding more complexity, more cost to the tax code, which I don't think makes sense to most people, but I think what we're going to find is that we're going to want to continue forward with some of these provisions in law because they make sense, even at a cost, but hopefully we'll be responsible and find a way to pay for them. But at this stage, what we're doing is adding to the deficit. Now, with this provision, if it were to pass here and if it were to become law, we now will have, this committee, I haven't voted for these, but those who voted for this will have added $16.5 billion to the federal deficit without paying for it and essentially costing the American taxpayers in higher taxes to them or decreased services to them in order to cover these tax breaks that are going to a fraction of the American public. Having said that, I know we still have one other bill, and therefore we'll yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. I just want to point out that this was also subject of the more than 7-hour hearing on charitable issues that we had before this committee. Also, this was something that came up in the working groups of many months, something that the private foundations came to us for, and part of it is the complexity of the current law. And Mr. Barthold, my question for you is, does this not simplify the calculation as a result of this change? Some private foundations could reduce to 1% anyway, depending on their qualifying distributions. So because this now would have a straightforward 1% excise tax. Does that not simplify the calculation for many of our foundations?
Any single rate system that's not predicated on prior action makes it simpler for the person filing the return for the foundation. This would clearly be a simplification for the foundation.
And particularly foundations that have endowments that vary significantly from year to year, given which we saw certainly in 2008 and after, foundations had significant different asset base.
Well, as you're alluding, the calculation of whether you qualify for the 1% rate or the 2% rate depends upon your history of distributions, and your distributions are keyed off of your asset base.
And the other point I think I just want to make is it's not so much that this is impacting the foundations, which it does, but what this will allow the foundations to do is hopefully devote more of their resources to their charitable purpose, and that's really, which is many, many tens of millions of Americans, I would say hundreds of millions of Americans that could benefit from. And I'm sure that's probably not information the Joint Committee on Taxation has in terms of how many Americans actually benefit from the charitable work that our foundations do.
Mr. Chairman?
I just want to get this answer. I mean, I know the point you were making about how many foundations are actually taxpayers, but I don't know that the Joint Committee has information on how many individual Americans are helped by the charitable work of foundations, private foundations.
Under law, the distributions from the private foundations have to go to charitable purposes, and so that's broadly a large number of different charitable organizations that are doing deeds in different facets of the exempt sector. The short answer is no, we don't have an estimate of how many people in any one year benefit from the work of charities that receive grants from private foundations.
Yes. All right. Did you have a comment?
Just a quick comment, Mr. Chairman, because again, these are the kind of discussions that we will ultimately have in discussing these particular provisions, but I would just note that it's ironic that in trying to simplify, we're actually going to cost the taxpayers more money, and so I don't think that the American public perceives making the tax code simpler or that simplification is going to end up costing the taxpayer more money. So this is the difficulty in putting forward these kinds of proposals.
Well,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. But Mr. Barthold, does your calculation factor in the fact that there may be less reliance on government programs if there's actually more charitable giving? More charitable private foundation resources going to charitable purposes and therefore less reliant on government programs?
Well, under our baseline assumptions that both we, the Congressional Budget Office, operate under, we don't assume that there are other changes in government programs or other policies based from one change in this area. I understand the point that you're making, and so the short answer is no. We do not assume that there might be savings to the government.
But intuitively, there might be. Any other questions on this for Mr. Barthold? There being no questions, are there any amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute? If there are no amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4691 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to.
I ask for ayes and nays.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady? Aye. Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Aye. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Aye. Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Aye. Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson?
Aye.
Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed?
Aye.
Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin? Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott? Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Kind? Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis? Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott? Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal? Mr. Blumenauer? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 10 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 10 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4691 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views so ordered. The last order of business is a bill introduced by Mr. Teaberry to modify and make permanent bonus depreciation. Mr. Teaberry, you're now recognized for an opening statement on the bill.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My bill would permanently extend 50% bonus depreciation, would allow businesses to forgo bonus depreciation and instead claim more of their unused alternative minimum tax credits, and would ensure more companies may take advantage of bonus depreciation. Bonus depreciation allows businesses to deduct immediately or expense 50% of new equipment purchases. It helps companies better access capital and invest in new facilities, buy equipment, and most importantly, create American jobs. I've heard from business owners in Ohio for years, time and again, that extending bonus depreciation is the single biggest factor in allowing their businesses to grow. First enacted after September 11th, 2001, bonus depreciation is increased, extended, and allowed to expire multiple times, Mr. Chairman, as you know. By making this provision permanent, businesses will have the certainty, underlined bold, the certainty needed to increase domestic investment, raise wages, and hire more people. If bonus depreciation is made permanent and a business owner or farmer knows he or she can more quickly expense necessary equipment, he will have the certainty needed to build another factory that he otherwise wouldn't have built, buy another piece of equipment that he otherwise wouldn't have bought, and hire another worker that he or she otherwise wouldn't have hired. At a time when capital expenditures are at levels that are anemic, this will increase investment and grow our economy. In fact, just today, Mr. Chairman, we received numbers that are pretty stunning. Economic growth in the first quarter is down for the first time during this recovery in the last 3 years. And in fact, since the fourth quarter to the first quarter, we've seen a 12% decline in capital investment. A 12% decline in capital investment at the time when bonus depreciation expired at the end of last year to the first quarter of this year. Additionally, the recent economic situation has caused many companies to operate at a loss, hampering their ability to take advantage of bonus depreciation. This bill would lift restrictions to allow for more corporate AMT credits, which are essentially overpaid taxes, to be used for capital investment. It will provide much-needed cash for investments in business operations and, again, job creation. A recent report by the Tax Foundation found that permanent 50% bonus depreciation would increase our country's GDP by over 1%, increase wages by over 1%, and create over 200,000 new jobs. Additionally, as the economy grows with the implementation of a permanent bonus depreciation, federal tax revenues will also grow. The Tax Foundation found that after an initial adjustment period, the federal government will receive $20 billion in additional tax revenue per year. Over the long term, this policy would pay for itself. Just talk to a farmer, just talk to a manufacturer on what this would do in terms of the investments they would make, the people they would hire. Mr. Chairman, I know we've heard this over and over again this morning with the previous bills, and so let me just take this head on, based upon what I've heard from my friends on the other side of the aisle. The ranking member has voted 6 times for unpaid bonus depreciation for over a 10-year period, and offering none of the benefits, quite frankly, of the certainty that permanency allows for investment in someone's business. None of that over the course of the last 14 years has been given to job creators, to farmers, having the understanding that this is not going to expire, that it's going to be made permanent. So we've had 10 years of bonus depreciation, multiple expirations, multiple recommitments to it within the budget window, not paid for. Ladies and gentlemen, this is so important for the growth of our economy. The budget window has not been paid for over the last 14 years, and today you're going to hear about that, but the reality is that making this permanent will have a great benefit to our economic growth in our country, something we desperately need, Mr. Chairman, based upon the recent news. I yield back.
All right, thank you. Mr. Levin is recognized for an opening statement.
Well, I've already spoken. I'll be very brief and then yield to Mr. McDermott. Yes, I voted for bonus depreciation because by the definition bonus, it meant it was temporary. And that's why it was proposed and supported in the Bush administration. And so I voted for it. And that's why the Bush administration insisted that it no longer prevail and insisted, I think, that it expire. And so then when the economy turned down again, we passed it. As CRS says, its temporary nature is critical to its effectiveness. And you say this will pay for itself? We've heard that song before. And it turned out that was a very sour song. And the deficits increased dramatically. And one last point before I yield. There's no use of saying this will help position us in conference. We know there is no way that this is going to be made permanent. You have voted for $310 billion added to the deficit. When you add this 287 to what else you have voted for, it's $303 billion more. So that comes to $614 billion added to the deficit. That's irresponsible, inconsistent, this provision, because the chairman said he excluded it from his draft. So it's inconsistent, it is irrational, and irresponsible. I yield to Mr. Doggett. I said to Mr.
Thank you very much. This does, as the name suggests, basically present the question of, can this Congress afford to hand out another bonus? This Congress, the House, has already approved $310 billion unpaid business tax breaks where we'll borrow from the Chinese or someone else to pay for them. And today we have the question of whether we should add to that another $300 billion. This particular provision is one that has been considered on a temporary basis in the past. It changes the standard accounting principle that when a business buys a machine tool or a truck, you spread out the cost of that over the useful life of the capital asset. And it changes that with the hope that if there's an incentive, the business will buy it quickly during an economic downturn. The only problem with that is it doesn't work except in political speeches. Mark Zandi of Moody's says that for every dollar we spent in the last economic downturn, we got 20 cents back. If we were talking about a direct investment program, a direct expenditure program where you got 20 cents for a dollar spent, why, that would be one of those line items in the budget that we always claim is there that Republicans will eliminate, called waste and inefficiency. This is that line. Goldman Sachs wrote earlier this year that the absence of extending this credit didn't have any significant effect. The Federal Reserve reached the same conclusion. I know it works well in speeches. The ancient alchemists thought that they could change straw into gold, and that's what's proposed here. It's just not fact-based, and of course in Congress everyone's entitled to their own facts. They're only interested in evidence-based conclusions when the evidence works your way. Well, the evidence doesn't work your way at this time. I'm for a pro-growth, pro-job creation tax code and governmental policy. And that's one that would focus on the competitiveness of our workforce, on investing in our students, in our schools. It's one that would encourage a competitive transportation system so that we can get our goods to market. And the folks that are advocating this proposal, which the chairman, by the way, only about a month ago, just like the Twinkie subsidy that got approved this morning, he rejected it and called for the repeal of the entire bonus depreciation provision on page 52 of his summary of his bill. But that provision is one that we have to balance against other ways to make our workforce competitive. And our tax code can be used to make our workforce competitive. I support the American Opportunity Tax Credit extension to give our young people more opportunity in higher education. From early childhood to post-grad, we need to be doing more to make our workforce competitive. What we don't need to do is to waste money on tax benefits that don't work, that don't generate jobs, that don't accomplish their purpose, and breaks that are accomplished with borrowing billions and billions of dollars at a time that we're told that we simply cannot afford to invest in our children, protect our seniors in retirement, meet the transportation needs of our country. It is a question of how we do that, how we assure the competitiveness of the United States, and using broken tax provisions won't do it.
Your time has expired.
Mr. Chairman.
The committee will now proceed to consideration of H.R. 4718, which was distributed in advance. Without objection, the bill will be considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I offer an amendment in the nature of a substitute, which was distributed in advance along with a green sheet explaining it. And without objection, the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered as read, open for amendment at any point, and considered base text for purpose of amendment. I'll again turn to Mr. Bartold to provide technical description of the amendment in the nature of a substitute, and we'll have questions after your presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Levin, the members have before them JCX 57, which describes the text of H.R. 4718, and the green sheet, JCX 63, which describes the chairman's amendment in the nature of a substitute. Under provision of law that expired December 31st of 2013, taxpayers were permitted bonus depreciation at 50%, as explained by Mr. Teaberry, 50% write-off of the cost of placing in service qualifying property. The proposal before you would make that provision of prior law a permanent part of the Internal Revenue Code. As part of that provision, there was a special rule that related to the application of bonus depreciation under long-term contract property. That rule would be made permanent. There is a rule that applies to the depreciation permitted to taxpayers under Section 280F relating to vehicles purchased as part of business operations. There's an additional $8,000 amount that may be permitted to be deducted as part of the bonus depreciation provision, that $8,000 figure would be indexed by the provision before you. In addition, the proposal before you expands the definition of qualified property to include qualified retail improvement property, and in addition, it would provide that bonus depreciation may be claimed on the expenses related to planting or grafting trees or vines that bear fruits and nuts. As a general matter, a tree or vine that bears fruit or a nut is not considered placed in service until after it becomes productive, and when you first plant them, they're not productive. So this would make planting trees and vines qualify for the bonus depreciation provision. These provisions would be effective for all qualified property placed in service after December 31st of 2013. That concludes my description of the proposal.
Thank you. Now we'll turn to questions. Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, to you and Mr. T. Berry for bringing this bipartisan legislation to the committee. How long are we going to allow Americans to suffer under this recovery? This is the weakest economic recovery in half a century. We're missing over $1 trillion in the economy and 5 million jobs that should be back in place by now. Wall Street's roaring, but Main Street's really suffering. Today, a family of 4 is missing $1,000 a month out of their budget because of this weak recovery. So what's missing? Is it consumer spending? No, that recovered some time ago. Is it government spending? No, that bounced back first. It's business investment. That's the missing ingredient. Investment in building, equipment, and software, and that's what the heart of this provision does. Temporary tax provisions create temporary results. Permanent tax provisions create permanent results. And the permanent benefits of this provision is that it lowers the cost of capital, increases investment in capital, and as a result, as Mr. T. Berry's pointed out, the economy grows, wages grow, and jobs grow. 200,000 new jobs as a result of this. I'd like to finish with this quote from President Obama on this provision. This will help small businesses upgrade their plants and equipment, and will encourage large corporations to get off the sidelines, start putting their profits to work. He may take the curious position that he supports this provision so much he'll vote against it, as our Democrat colleagues have done today. We ought to work in a bipartisan way, get people back to work. I yield back.
All right, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me first start by commending Pat Tiberi and his proposal, and for the opportunity to work with him along these lines, because I do think much of what he said is vitally important. It certainly is important in my district, and especially in the manufacturing base. And I do appreciate the President's remarks, as was made by Mr. Brady, in terms of how this can both stimulate and grow the economy. I agree with all of that, although I want to associate myself with the remarks of our, Mr. Levin in saying that this has always been a tool, however, that is viewed as not one that was permanent, but one that should be focused on temporarily and reviewed consistently by this committee, thereby giving us the tools to sort out some of the studies and discrepancies that occur in terms of what kind of bonus depreciation actually works. I do think that that's an important role. And further, I intend to introduce an amendment, and as the day is gone, I expect that it will not be made in order to make sure to make these a 2-year proposal and that it be paid for. But I do want to commend Mr. Tiberi and also add this. I note, and I would hope we would be open to this, and I take the chairman at his word that he would like to see us convene. I would love to see us go to regular order and go to a conference committee. I'd love to see us there on tax reform. I hope we get there on the extenders. I'd also like to see a House hand always strengthened in dealing with the Senate But in my 16 years here in Congress, I have not yet seen a year that has been completed in regular order. And we always end up in continuing resolution or an omnibus bill. So, as my grandfather would say, the rationale for my proposing an amendment that is paid for is trust everyone, but cut the cards. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
We have about 2 minutes left in this time for vote. We can either go to vote on this bill. I expect the votes on the floor will last over an hour, or we can come back. It's up to you. But I have Ms. Schwartz and then Mr. Becerra. You're recognized.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a couple comments on this because it is the biggest provision of the the six we're looking at today. And I've supported bonus depreciation. I think it's been important, particularly as we have come through this recession, to be stimulative, to help those businesses, particularly manufacturers, be able to make those investments and write them off. But the way this is being done right now, and the way it was done in April, is to pick off then another six provisions, when in fact it was the chairman's intention to look at the tax provisions in a way that really had several different criteria. Did they really work? Did they benefit growing the economy? And are they worth the trade-offs in the fact that this is a cost to American taxpayers? Because in fact, well, I don't think Mr. Bartold was asked this question directly, but it was pointed out that we have to borrow this money. We have to find $600 billion that we have to borrow, likely from foreign countries. We have to pay interest on it, and that is a cost to the taxpayers. And it may mean that we are not able to do what we need to do going forward, which is to really look at all of these tax provisions and see what is important to continue, what should be temporary, and what should be permanent. So while I know time is short, I will just say that as someone who has supported bonus depreciation, I think it's increasingly important for us, before we make one permanent and cost the taxpayer literally $300 billion over the next 10 years, to make sure that it truly does work and that it is more important than others that in terms of what we have to pay. And that's what we're not doing today, which is why we are going to vote a no on this provision in terms of making it permanent. It is not the way to actually do serious tax reform that grows the economy, that meets our responsibilities as a government and as a nation, and make sure that we do this in a way that is fair to American taxpayers. The process this morning and well into this afternoon is in fact violating that very rule of the chairman, which is why I certainly am not for a permanent extension at this time.
All right, Mr. Becerra.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So rather than ask Mr. Bartold the questions, I'll just, from your analysis, of the 5 bills that we've watched go through this committee, this would add $16.5 billion to the deficit that the American taxpayers would have to carry. But of the bills, this is the mother of the tax breaks for today, because while the 5 previous bills added $16.5 billion to the deficit, this would add $287 billion to the deficit by itself. So a total, if all these 6 bills passed, of $304 billion that American taxpayers would now have heaped upon them to cover in some respect, whether through increased taxes or through cuts to services. If you could also provide us with the information of the number of filers who claim bonus depreciation, that would be helpful. And finally, on the point about making this permanent, as the Congressional Research Service has said to us, the value of the bonus depreciation is its temporary nature, and that it's, quote, critical to its effectiveness. By making it permanent, you kill the effectiveness. Let me give a quick example that most of us who are parents understand. Johnny doesn't want to eat his vegetables. You say, Johnny, eat your vegetables. Guess what? You'll get your dessert. By making the bonus depreciation permanent, you're essentially telling Johnny, Johnny, don't worry. You will forever, permanently get your dessert whether or not you eat your vegetables. So we're telling everyone with bonus depreciation that don't worry about eating the vegetables, about doing this tough stuff in America to create jobs. You're going to get your dessert one way or the other. At a $300 billion price tag, that's a lot to ask. With that, I'll yield back.
All right, I understand Mr. Larson has an amendment.
Yes, I do.
And if the clerk could distribute the amendment, and if you'd suspend for a minute while the amendment's being distributed.
I would reserve a point of order.
Point of order has been reserved. Go ahead, Mr. Larson.
Thank you, Mr. Camp. And my amendment is straightforward. It follows the widened version in the Senate and pays for 2 years for the bonus extension. Let me add that I hope, and I know I pretty much think we can anticipate this, but I do hope concerns for restaurants, which have been left out of this proposal, are taken in. I do believe that once we do get to some form of conference, the temporary nature that a number of my colleagues have outlined is one that we will, in all likelihood, conform to because of the obvious benefits that have been alluded to this. I hope we continue to work together, but do feel it important because of the deficits that we are working under that we have a vote on this bill.
All right. The gentleman from Texas will be heard on this point of order.
Mr. Chairman, I make a point of order of the amendment because it's not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute. The amendment violates House Rule 16, Clause 7, because the offset that denies the domestic manufacturing deduction to major integrated oil companies is not of the same subject matter as the substitute.
Given the time, I'm not going to ask for a roll call vote, and you can move the vote. I think it's intuitively obvious what it would be.
Okay, I'm prepared to rule the amendment is not germane to the amendment in the nature of a substitute because it violates House Rule 16, Clause 7 by including subject matter that is not the same as the subject matter of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. If there are no further amendments, the question is on the adoption of the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. I will now recognize Mr. Johnson for the purpose of offering a motion.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee favorably report H.R. 4718 as amended to the House of Representatives.
The question is on favorably reporting the bill. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed signify by saying no. The ayes have it. The motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Johnson?
Aye.
Mr. Johnson, aye. Mr. Brady?
Aye.
Mr. Brady, aye. Mr. Ryan? Aye. Mr. Ryan, aye. Mr. Nunez? Aye. Mr. Nunez, aye. Mr. Teaberry? Aye. Mr. Teaberry, aye. Mr. Reichert? Mr. Reichert, aye. Mr. Bustani? Aye. Mr. Bustani, aye. Mr. Roscom? Mr. Roscom, aye. Mr. Gerlach? Mr. Gerlach, aye. Mr. Price? Mr. Price, aye. Mr. Buchanan? Aye. Mr. Buchanan, aye. Mr. Smith? Mr. Smith, aye. Mr. Schock? Mr. Schock, aye. Ms. Jenkins? Ms. Jenkins, aye. Mr. Paulson? Mr. Paulson, aye. Mr. Marchant? Mr. Marchant, aye. Ms. Black? Ms. Black, aye. Mr. Reed? Mr. Reed, aye. Mr. Young? Aye. Mr. Young, aye. Mr. Kelly? Mr. Kelly, aye. Mr. Griffin? Aye. Mr. Griffin, aye. Mr. Renacci? Mr. Renacci, aye. Mr. Levin? No. Mr. Levin, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. McDermott? No. Mr. McDermott, no. Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal? Mr. Becerra? No. Mr. Becerra, no. Mr. Doggett? No. Mr. Doggett, no. Mr. Thompson? No. Mr. Thompson, no. Mr. Larson? No. Mr. Larson, no. Mr. Blumenauer? No. Mr. Blumenauer, no. Mr. Kind? No. Mr. Kind, no. Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Ms. Schwartz? Ms. Schwartz, no. Mr. Davis? No. Mr. Davis, no. Ms. Sanchez? No. Ms. Sanchez, no. Mr. Rangel? Mr. Lewis? Mr. Neal? Mr. Pascrell? Mr. Crowley? Chairman Camp?
Aye.
Chairman Camp, aye.
The clerk will report the vote.
23 ayes, 11 noes.
There being 23 ayes and 11 noes, the motion is agreed to. H.R. 4718 as amended is ordered favorably reported to the House of Representatives. Without objection, staff is authorized to make technical and conforming changes to the bill. Without objection, members will have an additional 2 days to file with the committee clerk supplemental, additional, or minority views so ordered. There being no further business before the committee stands adjourned.